I'd like us to spend the next half hour or so in the company of Cyril Connolly. And for those of you who don't have details of Connolly's career immediately to hand, I should say that he was born in 1903, died in 1974, went to school with George Orwell and to university with Evelyn Waugh, produced several scintillating collections for literary journalism, and in the 1950s and 1960s, when he occupied a berth on the books pages of the Sunday Times, was regarded as possibly the most influential non-academic critic of literature in England. Known to his intimate friends as Boots, after Virginia Woolf had complained about that smarty Boots Connolly, he was, among other aspects of a multifarious personality, a romantic, a myth-maker, a sensualist, a classicist, and a skeptic, who, when asked what his definition of happiness was, is supposed to have replied, "To be writing a tolerably good book and travelling south in the company of someone your conscience permits you to love." He disliked above all the increasing colonisation of literature by academics, against whom he fought a desperate and unsuccessful rearguard action. As someone who spent nearly half a century supporting himself by the pen, he was much concerned, obsessed is not too strong a word, by the conditions in which books get written, and what he imagined to be the overriding difficulty facing any writer, which is to create a satisfactory environment in which he or she can pursue his craft. He died hopelessly in debt, and a trust fund had to be got up to support his wife and children. Of his many books, the one which ought to concern us the most 4 decades after his death is a curiously hybrid piece of non-fiction entitled Enemies of Promise, an attempt to identify, albeit from the vantage point of 1938, some of the snares that lie in wait for apprentice writers and the many impediments strewn across their path, all that random environmental baggage whose cumulative effect is to prevent them from producing the books that they burn to write. Like much of the raw material that went to make up the Connolly myth, Enemies is several things altogether. On the one hand, a rueful evocation of his Etonian and Oxonian adolescence. On the other, a pitiless exploration of his own neuroses. It's also an open hold for a bumper cargo of lapidary epigrams, simultaneously an apparently objective analysis of the conditions in which literature gets written, in which Connolly sets out with the aim of establishing what qualities or strokes of fortune are required to enable a book to last 10 years. And a study of one particular author and his attempts to fulfill this task. If there are victims, then one of them, or so we infer from the demoralising downward march that turns his exemplar, a made-up character called Walter Savage Shelley Blake, from a young man of promise into a magazine hack seduced into writing an endless succession of reviews for the pointedly named Mr. Vampire of the Blue Brugos, is Connolly himself. Enemies of Promise is divided into 3 parts, a scorching 100 pages or so of literary criticism, in which Connolly anatomizes the contending styles of the 1930s, a final third sorrowing over his early 20th century boyhood, and then, sandwiched between them, a section entitled The Shylock's Shade, in which George Crabbe's early 19th century poem, The Heath, is pressed into service as a metaphorical lexicon. And it goes, "Their thistles stretch their prickly arms afar, and to the ragged infant threaten war. Their poppies, nodding, mock the hope of toil. There the blue bugloss paints the sterile soil. Hardy and high, above the slender sheaf, the slimy mallow waves her silky leaf. O'er the young shoot the charlock throws a shade, and clasping tares cling round the sickly blade. With mingled tints the rocky coasts abound, and a sad splendour vainly shines around." What we have here, Connolly goes on to explain, is the literary world of the 1930s in miniature. Crabbe's thin harvest may be taken as the achievement of young authors. The withered ears are their books, and the militant thistles are politics. The nodding poppies are drink, daydreams, and diversion. The blue bugloss, the clarion call of journalism, and the slimy mallow, that of worldly success. The charlock doubles up as sex, and the clasping tares are the obligations of duty and domesticity. The mingled tints are the varieties of talent and accomplishment which duly appear, and the sad splendour is that of their evanescent promise. These enemies of literature, these parasites on genius, require detailed examination, Connolly then informs us, for they are blights from which no writer is immune. Naturally, there are some distinctions to be made. Connolly, let us remember, was writing in 1938, the year of the Munich Pact, when he suggests that a writer must grow used to the idea that culture as we know it may disappear and remain lost forever or till it is excavated 1,000 years hence from a new Herculaneum, and that at any moment the schools of Athens may be closed and the libraries burned. He's not talking about the retreat of newspaper arch pages and the squeeze on publishers' lists, but the prospect of Armageddon. And when he insists that the writer must be a lie detector who exposes the fallacies in words and ideals before half the world is killed for them, he is reacting to some highly specific threats to civilized life that no person who put pen to paper in the late 1930s could altogether ignore. At the same time, he's always worth reading on the more mundane pressures experienced by the man or woman in search of, as he rather grandiosely puts it, the truth that is always being clouded over by romantic words and ideas, or obscured by actions and motives dictated by interest and fear, if only because the reader senses that he has felt them himself, that the acidiae he diagnoses as one of the great stumbling blocks placed in the writer of the Auden era's path can be traced back to himself, the New Statesman critic in the Chelsea flat, squandering his talent on this week's fiction roundup when he should be writing the great masterpiece that will knock Proust into a cocked hat. Or rather not squandering it, because there's a counter-argument lurking behind the satire of Walter Savage Shelley Blake, which urges us not to forget the importance of the New Statesman critic tapping out his 1,000 words on the Nonsuch Boswell and the forces he represents. And so, to revert to that Connolly model, what snares lie in wait for the young writer of today? Creeping domesticity, marital obligation, interest-free mortgages, all the urgent summonses of hearth and home encapsulated by Connolly's immortal phrase, the pram in the hall, are more easily avoided now than they were 80 years ago. Significant others don't always require to be taken to the altar. Neither do they necessarily want children. There are other options, other relationship choices to be made. Although, as someone once pointed out, the most promising sexual state for a modern writer to inhabit is that of the gay man or woman. Overheads are lower, and you have a ready-made subject to write about. As for the militant thistles, politics, too, is not the drain on a writer's energies that it was in the age of the Jarrow March and the Spanish Civil War. The last decade in which there was any real sense of a political divide that extended into literature in this country was the 1980s, an age in which Mrs. Thatcher dined with right-wing acolytes such as Kingsley Amis and V.S. Naipaul, while her left-leaning opponents wrote multi-signature letters to The Guardian about spending cuts and the miners' strike, or cabaled in Lady Antonia Fraser's drawing room in Camden Hill Square. Certainly the most recent assemblage of literary opinion on a great political issue of the day, the Authors Take Sides on Iraq volume of 2004, was a rather muted affair, in which dislike of the Blair government alternated with the suspicion that the days when writers could be expected usefully to contribute to debates of this kind were gone. What about Mr. Vampire and the review columns of the Blue Goss? Literary journalism is more easily avoided now for the painful reason that in an era of declining print circulations and negligible fees, there's a lot less of it to be had. So little, in fact, that the 30-something novelist, looking up from the reviews of his under-publicised first novel to contemplate the looming spectacle of the second, while wondering how much longer he'll have to endure his part-time job in a public relations agency, would quite like to know where this particular enemy of promise can be found, so that he can have the pleasure of experiencing some of its supposedly injurious effects for himself. What has really changed, perhaps, in the 3/4 of a century since Connolly set to work, are some of the fundamental structures through whose agency literature gets produced. These are less to do with the publishing industry's periodic reconfigurations than with the manner in which the modern literary world's talent pool finds itself being cultivated, and the near collapse of what might be called the old-styled freelance literary economy. Which is to say that 30 or even 20 years ago, a competent novelist who was prepared to eke out his or her income by taking on other literary jobs, such as book reviewing and feature writing, could expect, narrowly, to make a living out of it. As the book's pages diminish in size and newspaper arts budgets perennially contract, that living is no longer available. In the vast majority of cases, to exist as a writer in this brave, new, technologically driven world of ours means signing up as a university teacher. Broadly speaking, the two most significant developments with the capacity to alter the outward face that literature presents to the world in the 21st century are the rise of creative writing MAs and the employment by university English departments of novelists and poets to teach them. The aspiring writer of the Connolly generation, on coming down from Oxford or Cambridge, where he generally read an art subject, marked time as a schoolteacher or a private secretary or compiled fiction roundups for weekly magazines before embarking on his first book. He, or sometimes she, was effectively an amateur, or at any rate self-taught, whose knowledge of the world he was attempting to infiltrate was picked up as he went along. His tutors, such as they were, tended to be literary editors, publishers' readers, or older writers met socially, and the advice they gave was strictly informal. The avant-garde English novelist Henry Green, for example, whom Amit talked so interestingly about yesterday, when asked where he'd honed his skills, used to pay tribute to Old Garnet, who was the literary advisor Richard Garnett, who played the same formative and unobtrusive role in the development of many young writers' careers in the 1920s, as, say, Malcolm Bradbury did in the 1970s. The difference being that Garnett was an obscure hack and Bradbury a justly celebrated professor of English and American literature at a distinguished university. If there are no more Richard Garnetts, then there are plenty more Malcolm Bradburys. In fact, university creative writing departments must be considered one of the most flourishing stocks on the modern academic boards. As long ago as 2004, the Times Literary Supplement calculated that there were 1,200 students at work on MA courses, and the figure must be at least twice that now. And meanwhile, the number of novelists seduced into teaching them increases exponentially. Of all the friends of mine beneath the age of 50 who would describe themselves as professional writers, only one of them isn't employed in a university. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? I would argue that it's a bad thing, the worst thing, as Martin Amis might say, but that the badness is only indirectly linked to the arguments traditionally levelled at the proliferation of university creative writing courses. It's not, for example, that the prospectus on which creative writing MAs are sold is essentially a false one, that 1,200 MA students means 1,200 first novels or poetry collections, and who in these straitened times is going to publish them. It's not that the leading departments impart their own authenticating sheen to the works produced under their aegis. My wife used to review first novels for The Guardian and maintained you could tell an Iowa book from the first half dozen pages. It's not that theoretical approaches to the study of literature mean more obfuscating jargon, and that within 24 hours of entering university English department, a writer will start talking about sequential realism-based narratives when he means stories. It's not even, to use a very common argument, that you can't teach people how to write, because even if you can't, you can certainly create an environment, and I'm echoing Malcolm Bradbury's words here, in which the business of putting words on paper can at least be usefully discussed. No. The problem about university creative writing MAs is that they are a further step towards the institutionalization of literature, which I would suggest is the last thing that literature needs if it's going to appeal to the wider community of readers on whom the survival of that literature beyond the status of rarefied academic pastime depends. But perhaps we need to go beyond discussions of whether a creative writing MA is a good thing or a bad thing and concede simply that it is an inevitable thing. That in a marketplace where the old economic model has collapsed, all we as writers can hope for is this new state and pupil subsidized industry where creative work is done in the intervals of teaching aspiring creators and shouldering the administrative burden that comes with it. Meanwhile, the implications for what might be called our wider literary culture and the kind of writers at large in it are deeply ominous. Consider, for the example, the early career of Connolly's little-known but no means unsuccessful friend, Esmé Beresford de Courcy Littlejohn, 1905 to 1982. Like Connolly, Littlejohn was educated at Eton, where he edited an abrasively modernist poetry magazine called Infractions, and invited Edith Sitwell to come and speak to the Literary Society. Upon leaving Balliol College, Oxford, where he secured a third-class degree in modern history, and drew polished sketches of his contemporaries for the university magazine, The Isis, and persuaded Aldous Huxley to address the college essay club, and was several times entertained at Lady Ottlin Morell's salon at Garsington, he secured temporary employment in the office of a London publicity firm. Introduced by an old school friend to the literary editor of The Spectator, he made his debut in 1929 with a review of another old school friend's first novel. More work of this kind soon followed, and with the encouragement of a wealthy uncle who allowed him a small private income until such time as he was able to establish himself, he set up as a writer of light historical biographies, their subjects including such figures as Madame de Staël, Sidney Smith and Lily Langtry. His contribution to Spain, Authors Take Sides, though ambiguous, was generally thought to express qualified support for Franco. By the late 1930s, now married to a baronet's daughter and living comfortably in South Kensington, he was making a steady £1,500 a year. Contrast this with the progress of Esmé's great-grandson, Hugo Littlejohn, born 1985. From an early stage, and mindful of the tug of ancestry, Hugo was determined to be a writer. To this end, in his late teens, he began to post small fragments of poetry and prose on an online website of his own devising. With the help of a supportive English master, he was able to acquire a place on the English Literature BA course at the University of Loamshire, where he wrote a much-admired final year dissertation on textual hermeneutics, before moving on at the age of 22 to a creative writing MA at the same establishment. Here, he had the great good luck to be taught by the Man Booker shortlisted author Terence Frisk, author of Droop Dahlias and In My Window Box. Hugo thinks Frisk quite a good writer, but rather old-fashioned in his approach, and the award-winning poet Sally McElhose, and also to have one of his short stories printed in the department's annual anthology, Spring Buds. Happily, this was noticed by an agent who attended the launch party, and within a year of leaving the University of Loamshire, he was at this point working part-time in the local branch of Waterstones, Hugo had his first novel, Come and Lie With Me, accepted for publication. The advance, sad to relate, was a mere £5,000, and the sales negligible, with the result that Hugo, now aged 27, shortly afterwards accepted an offer from his alma mater to return to its creative writing department as an assistant lecturer. Here, he spends a great deal of time attending departmental meetings, standing at the photocopier, keeping up with the jargon, and conciliating the egos of his students. His second novel, the provisionally titled Sighs and Whispers, is still incomplete. On the plus side, he's been asked to organise an interdisciplinary conference to be attended by several internationally distinguished writers, which it is hoped will help to advertise the exciting new partnership the university has recently entered into with the local council and East Midlands Arts, with the aim of establishing Loamshire as a cultural hub. What's the essential difference between Esmé and his great-grandson? The one, it might be said, treated the business of writing as an amusing and profitable way to make a living. The other is thoroughly professionalised, as accomplished a technician in his way as a mechanical engineer, or the celebrated soda siphon manufacturer Ezekiel Littlejohn, 1823 to 92, Esmé's own great-grandfather, a former ploughboy who, by his solid industry and perseverance, first put the family on the map. At the same time, there are other discrepancies. Esmé, for example, spent much of the early 1930s travelling in parts of the world that were, at this time, more or less off the map. Tipping the Bearer, his account of an excursion to the interior of Mali, is still worth reading even today. He also fought in the Second World War, latterly in military intelligence, where he was supposed to have had dealings with the secret services. Someone with a feel for the period and a knowledge of upper-class life in the interwar era could write an illuminating biography of Esmé. But it is very unlikely that 60 years hence one will be written about Hugo, who seems set to see out his days in further education, writing occasional novels that will, however much zest he bring to them, inevitably reflect the protocols of the organisations he serves and on whose behalf he labours. Hugo, in other words, has been institutionalised, turned into one of literature's civil servants, the literary equivalent of an undersecretary at the Home Office, a process which, it might be argued, is far more of a threat to the survival of any kind of meaningful literary culture than cyberspace or online collaboration. None of this is Hugo's fault. He wants to be a writer, and these, generally speaking, are the hoops through which the apprentice has to jump in order to succeed in an ever more crowded professional marketplace. The role of man of action, which so many bygone practitioners of his craft so desperately coveted, is denied him by the radically altered world into which he was born. The average modern novelist, it is fair to say, goes to university to study creative writing and then ends up teaching it, bypassing the life that gives ballast to fiction for the minute explication of the fiction of itself. If so many modern novels are not, as so many critics complain, about anything except the process that brings them into existence, then this is because so many of the people who write them are creatures of the lecture hall. They are, as James Wood once put it about A.S. Byatt, a remark I disagree with, by the way, just too well educated to indulge themselves in an activity where the most valuable quality of all is instinct. And if his faintly parasitical status is not Hugo's fault, then neither is it the fault of university creative writing departments, which are full of distinguished writers producing excellent novels. Merely an acknowledgement that in a world where most writers can never hope to make a living out of their work, they are a necessary evil, a sort of glorified employment bureau, which at any rate prevents novelist X, or indeed Hugo Littlejohn, from having to work in a bank. But whether he or she teaches at the University of Loamshire, works for an advertising agency, or juggles various kinds of increasingly ill-paid journalism, The contemporary writer is fated to discover that most of the conditions that attend his or her professional life, from the modes of modern publishing to the vengeful ghosts of the technological machine, are enemies of promise. As for their cumulative effect, this can only be to inhibit the writer's ability to say the things that people do not wish to hear, which might be defined as one of the main functions of literature in this or any other age. Thank you.